It's February 16, 2011. My name is Don Linky. We're here in Moorestown, New Jersey for the Rutgers program on the governor. We're going to discuss this afternoon with William F. Hyland his long and varied career in New Jersey government, politics, and the private sector. General Hyland started his political career in South Jersey, was elected to the General Assembly, eventually became Speaker of the General Assembly, later was named as President of the Public Utilities Commission, and then subsequently as the first chairman of the newly organized New Jersey State Commission on Investigation. At the beginning of Brendan Burns' administration in 1974, he was appointed as the Attorney General of the state of New Jersey and served through Governor Burns' first term. He subsequently returned to the private practice of law, became a major figure in New Jersey legal circles with the firm then known as Riker, Danzig, Shearer, Hyland, and Peretti, and has also served, as we'll discuss, in some interesting legal roles, particularly as the executor of the estate of Benny Goodman. General Hyland has had associations with New Jersey governors going back to Governor Robert Minor. We'll talk about his various relationships with New Jersey governors from the 1950s through present day. General, before we get into more specifics of your very interesting career, I wanted to start with some general thoughts about the office of governor in New Jersey over your lifetime. How has it changed? Is it stronger or weaker today from when you first sort of came into contact with the institution of the New Jersey governor?
It's very difficult for me to measure strength or weakness or those attributes, but it's very clear to me that the office is much closer to the people, much more accountable, notwithstanding what the political campaigns might say, than it was when I first got started. When I first got started, everyone seemed to know the governor. And the governor did not have the same backup or staff or whatever you want to call it that he has today. It's a big business today. And I don't know whether that is producing a better result or not.
Let's go back a little. You're a product of South Jersey. Talk a little bit about your childhood, family, your parents.
I was born not very far from where we are at the moment in Burlington County. My birthplace was Burlington City, but my family moved to Camden within about 6 weeks after I was born. And I grew up in Camden as a result of that move. And I felt very gratified by what Camden gave to me and to my siblings. We had wonderful schools and fine libraries, good neighborhoods. It was a thriving and very positive and encouraging town. It's much different today, unfortunately, as we know Camden's rateable base declined greatly, and many of its activities suffered as a result of that. In recent months, I've been reading about layoffs in the police department and of teachers and of other vital public servants. And it's sad to me because I felt that I had a great upbringing in Camden.
When did the family first come to America?
In the late 1600s. My forebears came from Ireland and settled in different parts of South Jersey. My most prominent ancestor was Emma Hyland, who was a Democratic political leader and later became one of the first female postmasters in the United States as postmaster of Camden. She was a remarkable woman and took me by the hand to many political gatherings and introduced me to many of the public figures in the Camden County area that I later got to know in my practice of law. It was very helpful. She was remarkable, and she was not only a great inspiration to me and to others, but she had much to do with the interest that was developed in South Jersey in the women's suffrage movement. And it was in the course of her lifetime that women got the vote. And she was a very happy camper when that came about.
Were other members of the family less enthusiastic about her prominent role in politics and government?
No, not at all. They were very proud of her, and much as I did, some of my siblings would go along with her to political gatherings and meetings of every type. And I think we all benefited very much from the exposure that she gave us to so many important facets of our life here in South Jersey.
Now, I realize you were very young at the time, but describe, to the extent you knew then or have learned since, what the politics of Camden were like. Was it machine run? Who were the prominent figures, if you can recall at all?
Well, Camden was much more in the Republican camp than the Democratic camp as I grew up. And my late grandmother, Emma Hyland, told me some very interesting and often humorous stories about political life in Camden. She, for example, in the old Fifth Ward, which was the heart and soul of the Republican machine in the 1918, 1920 span, she would go there. She would go into that ward on election night to kind of oversee the vote count. And on one occasion, some political thugs came in to steal the machine, the ballot box. And one of the family stories is that she raised such a fuss. They eventually carried it out, but she was sitting on top of it while they did that.
I'm not sure things have changed much over the years.
Well, I don't know that much about the politics in Camden anymore, but it's an entirely different city, as we know, and I suppose it has its own stories of political life.
Now, was she active as early as the Woodrow Wilson governorship in 1911?
Oh yes, in fact, it was her admiration for Woodrow Wilson that led her into politics.
And did she ever meet him?
Oh yes, she knew him, and most of the other figures of prominence in those days. Frank Hague, the boss of Jersey City, and many said the boss of New Jersey, was one of her close acquaintances. Mm. And there were many others who later became judges and congressmen and what have you in our state.
Mm-hmm. When in your youth did you think about what career you wanted to pursue?
I can't really give you a date, but I don't recall any time when I didn't think about going into public life at some point. And when I was in high school, for example, I ran for the student government and became president. And I suppose that was a precursor of what I did in later years by getting active in the real life politics.
Other than Emma Hyland, were there other sort of political heroes or mentors that you identified with at that time?
Yes, I would say so. For example, Sam Orlando, who was a very prominent lawyer who had come up as an immigrant, I believe, from Cumberland County. He grew up in the Vineland admire, became a great friend of my grandmother's, and in later years he and I were well acquainted, and I admired him greatly. And Vince Gallagher and well, dozens of others, John Crane. These are all figures of prominence and stature in our party.
What did your father and mother do for a living?
My mother was a housewife, the mother of 6 children, so she had little or no time for anything else. My father was a draftsman at RCA Victor, and he retired from Victor. He told me many stories over the years about the hardship days of the Depression as they affected Victor and Camel Soup and so on. And he sort of moved across the street from time to time between RCA and Camel Soup. And there were days that things were so tight that employees like my father would have to report to work and would not know whether they were going to be allowed to go on the clock that day. And there were many days that he came home disgruntled and discouraged because he wasn't able to be put to work.
This would have been during the Depression or even earlier?
During the Depression. I would say in the early 30s and mid-30s, days were like that.
What did a draftsman do for RCA Victor in those days?
Well, he was artistic, for one thing. He would draw plans and lay out electrical installations and things of that type. And my father had pretty good schooling for a youngster in those days of a technical nature. The Spring Garden Institute in Philadelphia was one of his schools. And over there he learned mechanical drafting, mechanical drawing, and other skills that were important to the kind of work that he was called upon to do.
Now, as you're in high school, what were your interests? Sports, music, always, I assume.
I guess my avocation was music. It always had been and always was in later years. And government. Through the influence of my grandmother, I got to meet congressmen and U.S. senators, and she would take me to Washington for different things. For example, she took me and several of my siblings to Washington on March 4th, 1933, I guess it would be, for the inauguration of Franklin Roosevelt. And we stood out there in the cold on that day and watched FDR get sworn in. Boy, that was big stuff for me.
Any other prominent people that you can remember? You said U.S. senators and congressmen. Any specifics?
Well, Mary T. Norton, a congresswoman from Jersey City, was a great friend of my grandmother's and helped her along the way, helped my grandmother along the way. That's all that comes to mind at the moment. Mm-hmm. Harry Moore was a great fan of my grandmother's, and he later became governor of New Jersey, Harry Moore, and she took me to Trenton and introduced me to Governor Moore, and boy, I thought that was hot stuff. And I asked him if he would write a dedication for our high school yearbook, which he agreed to do. And so we had a very nice photograph of Governor Moore and a nice message to the students of Camden High School as a result of that visit.
How about another governor and U.S. senator who's become somewhat of a celebrity lately because of the focus on Atlantic City, Governor Edge?
Walter Edge.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever meet him?
I don't.
Of course, a Republican.
Yeah, I don't think I ever met Walter Edge, although I certainly knew of him and admired his career. He was quite an outstanding figure, I think.
Now, when you're finishing high school, did the family have enough means that you thought about college, or was that sort of a uncertain proposition at that point?
We never seemed to give a second thought to whether I could go to college. My family was not well-to-do, but we did have Emma Hyland, my grandmother, as sort of a patron saint, and I know that she wrote checks from time to help me with tuition when I went over to the University of Pennsylvania. She always wanted me to study corporate law. She thought that was the pathway to stardom or something, but I never did, as a specialty, practice corporate law. But it was nice to have her behind me. And I entered the Wharton School, majored in accounting, and enjoyed that very, very much. Finally came to the point with the onset of the war with Germany and Japan that I just couldn't continue in the same sense that I had originally, and we better stop for a minute.
Okay, we'll stop. General, we were talking about college, enrolling at the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania. Of course, this is also at the time that the Second World War is about to break out, and you would then go into the Navy. Let's talk about first your college days before you go into the Navy. What were they like? I assume it was somewhat upsetting, given that the war was about to break out or was actually underway at that point.
Well, I was in college at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack. I recall being at a rushing party, they called it, at the fraternity that I ultimately joined, Phi Kappa Psi. And this was a Sunday afternoon, about 2 o'clock our time. We had the radio on, and we're socializing and chatting as a group of fellows will do, when there was a break-in by the announcer who said that we had been attacked at Pearl Harbor. And we were all stunned because we were all in the, I would say, 16 to 25 year age group, and realized that life would be profoundly different as the result of what we were listening to. And it was. I enlisted shortly after that in the Navy Reserve, and fortunately I was reassigned to the Wharton School to finish as much of my education as I could. And let's see, I stayed there for about a year and a half, and eventually was transferred to Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, for a brief waiting period while an opening would develop at Harvard, where the Navy had its Supply Corps school. And I was sent up to the Harvard school and graduated from that as an ensign. I loved the Navy as much as you can love something like that, but because it was a family tradition, and I had my concerns about the stress of being in the infantry, let's say. And when I was assigned to a destroyer escort, I was very much relieved, and went on convoy duty in the North Atlantic on the USS Blessman as its supply officer and paymaster. And after a trip to Northern Ireland and back, on the return, we were advised that we were going to be converted to what they called an APD, attack transport. And we were given a team of frogmen. And our mission would be to take these swimmers, who were all great athletes and great swimmers, into or near the beach, and they would do all kinds of reconnoitering, and then we would come back and hopefully pick them all up and return to our mothership. So that took me into the Pacific, where I participated in the invasion of the Philippines and the invasion of Iwo Jima. And as we say, I almost lost my life at Iwo Jima because I was seated in my small office up on the boat deck after the activities of the day, which would be fighting off kamikazes. And when there was a lull, we would try to get some of our daytime duties out of the way. And I was seated in my office, as I said, and we were hit with two 500-pound bombs dropped by a Japanese Betty, they called that particular plane. And one of them hit the superstructure and bounced off into the water. The other one went through the boat deck, the main deck, and the engineering deck down into the engineering spaces about 10 feet from where I was seated. So while it didn't explode until it was below decks, it had a delayed reaction, and that saved my life, because if it had exploded in that proximity to me, I wouldn't be here. So I was a very, very lucky guy.
Was anyone killed in that attack?
We lost about 40 of our men. And we lost all power and the ability to do anything. Our guns were powerless because they depended upon power. So they the Navy took us under tow. An amphibious ship had by then discharged its complement of Marines and so on, and came back and took us under tow and towed us down to Saipan, which took 2 or 3 days, I guess. And we stayed in Saipan for about 6 weeks, getting temporary repairs so that we could proceed beyond Saipan, and we headed back under our own power by then, limited as it was, to Mare Island, California, where major repairs were made. And by then we had been converted from a DE, destroyer escort, to an APD. And we were totally committed then to the underwater demolition movement.
Any other stories or anecdotes about the Navy service?
Well, we had lots of time to explore Saipan during that temporary repair period, and I took advantage of it because I was fascinated with what had happened there. And when I got onto Saipan, I realized that a cousin of mine was there as a B-29 pilot, because the B-29s that bombed Japan quite regularly by then were housed, headquartered on Saipan or Tinian, and that was a wonderful time for me because I hadn't met this cousin but once or twice in my lifetime, and we became great friends and had a lot of good times together then and thereafter.
What are your memories of VJ Day?
Oh, they're very vivid because I had developed a stomach problem of a chronic nature, and was in the hospital at Treasure Island, a naval station just outside of San Francisco. And I was in a room with one other Navy fellow, and they started bringing others in, wounded or worse. And that was because that day happened to be VJ Day, and all hell broke loose in San Francisco with the excitement of our victory. And while it was a glorious time, a time of great happiness, it was also a time when some things that weren't so good happened to those who were celebrating. Mm-hmm. They got pushed through store windows, and it was just, the town went crazy, and it wasn't good.
When were you discharged?
About a year later, I guess. Yeah. And by then, the greatest thing that ever happened to me had happened. I had met my future wife.
Tell us about that.
Oh, well. That's one of the glories of my life. My grandmother, Emma Hyland, had died just about then. And I was able to get permission to fly home for her funeral, but I didn't have the same priority on the way back. So they said, you'll have to go back by train, and they gave me information about the military sleeper trains that we would be taking. And I got on board in Philadelphia, and then transferred to another train in Chicago, not realizing that my future wife had or was about to board the same train to return to her college, University of Southern California in Los Angeles, where she was a voice major. She was a marvelous soprano. And she was seated in the club car, and I was in the club car with the two other military guys, and we wanted to play bridge, and we needed a fourth. So I said, well, why don't I ask that young lady down at the end of the car if she plays bridge? And I did, and she said that she did, but she didn't. But we forgave her for it. But the first thing she said, how many cards do I deal? We knew that we had gone down the wrong road. But the natural attraction that we had, I guess, for each other, supplemented by the music that we were both so interested in, led to a dating situation. And my wife counted the dates. She said, you know, we've only had 16 dates between now and the time that you proposed. And I said, well, you know, so what?
Because geographically, you're pretty far away from each other, aren't you?
From where?
Geographically, you're...
Oh, yeah. We were not very thoughtful of considerate of our parents, either in Illinois, where Joan's parents lived, or in New Jersey, where my parents and family lived, because no one in the family had met either one of us. And it wasn't until the day of our wedding in Anacostia, D.C., that the two families met in the back of the church.
But also, on the train back, you were on your way to San Francisco, and she was on her way to Los Angeles. No, or am I wrong?
No, by then I had been transferred to another hospital out of Treasure Island and into one in outside of Los Angeles.
Oh, so it wasn't that difficult to see each other.
She was just a little forward, I used to say, because on Thanksgiving, she came to the hospital and surprised me with a visit with some flowers, and I think that gave a jump start to our romance.
Now, given the different locations of the families, did you have any second thoughts about returning to New Jersey after you got out of the service?
No, I think Joan and I both took for granted that we'd be going to New Jersey because that's where I had the best chances of making a living and completing any other schooling that I might need. You know, before all of this, the University of Pennsylvania kindly gave me a degree in absentia, as they call it, because in 1943, which was a year before my normal graduation date. But they took a look at my record at Harvard and decided that they could award me a degree. So that much of my schooling was behind me, and I had been offered a job with Price Waterhouse in Philadelphia as an accountant. So we decided it would be a good idea for us to go there. And we rented an apartment just across the street in Parkside, Camden, from my family, and set up housekeeping there. And I continued my schooling by then at the University of Pennsylvania Law School.
Now, was the decision to become a lawyer sort of a byproduct of your interest in public service?
I think so, yes. Yeah, I was always interested in current events, especially those that involve the government, the state or the local governments. And yes, so that's the direction that I started to head.
Let's go back a little bit to the mutual interest in music that you and your wife Joan have. You also start or continue, I guess, performing in bands at that time while you're in law school. And what is she doing at this time?
Well, she was singing with various choirs, with the Mendelssohn Club in Philadelphia, for example, where she was greeted with open arms because she was an extraordinarily gifted soprano. When I first came out of the service, I took a job with Chuck Gordon's band in Ocean City, Maryland for the summer. We played 6 nights a week at the Pier Club in Ocean City. And they hired Joan as a hat check girl.
Little gender inequity there.
Pardon?
A little gender inequity.
Yes, yes.
What was that like in sort of the those days of being in a band and being in the summer at a beachfront resort, almost like Jersey Shore today, I guess?
Well, you couldn't fashion a better honeymoon than that. I came out of the service at the end of June, let's say, I think it was the end of June, and immediately started to work in Ocean City, Maryland at the Pier Club. And I played there in July and August and probably until Labor Day in September. And we enjoyed the beach, and we were with, it was about a 15-piece band, I guess. And these were good friends with like interests. And it was just a wonderful honeymoon period.
In those days, did the band sort of stay in one spot, or were there tours, or how was it handled in
Well,
those
that
days?
band stayed in one spot. I had been with other bands that went on tour or played theaters or whatever. I played year after year after year with the Ice Capades when it came to Philadelphia, or the other ice show. I can't think of the name of it. And with Johnny Weissmuller and Roy Rogers and the Sons of the Pioneers. And I did all those things at the Philadelphia Arena in the first several years of our marriage. And it was a godsend because it was good money, and it didn't interfere too greatly with my schooling. A little sleepy in the mornings, but it was a lot better than waiting on tables.
In law school, any favorite professors or courses?
I missed that.
I said, in law school, did you have any favorite courses or professors?
Yes, I always enjoyed the property courses, and the professors' names I don't recall too well. John Honnold was a good friend and a professor in civil rights, in civil remedies. Mm-hmm. And I was fortunate enough to be president of the class in law school, and that brought me into close contact with our dean, Owen J. Roberts, who was a very famous lawyer. And my law school experience was, to me, delightful. I enjoyed it very, very much and hated to leave.
Let's break for a little bit. General, we were talking about your days in law school. Now that you're moving toward the end, what were your decisions about a career choice. You'd already dabbled in accounting for a little bit, but was the next step definitely to go into private practice of law or government, or what else?
To go into the private practice of law, I had some good friends in Camden, lawyers, and I had one or two offers to go in with them, and I eventually joined a firm, forget the name, it's not important, but in Camden, and had good friends there, and enjoyed the practice very much. Got exposed to a lot of different things. They did a good deal of defense work, and
criminal defense?
no,
Civil defense.
Civil defense, yes. And I was more or less thrown into that mix, and picked up a lot of practical knowledge rather quickly, because I would be handed 3 or 4 or 5 files on a Friday morning and told to handle some pretrial conferences or something of that sort. So, as I said, it was a very quick and practical experience that I had with the Starr, Summerall, and Lloyd firm in Camden. And one of my good friends there, particularly good friends, was Sid McCord. And Sid and I talked a lot about different things. He was a Republican and I a Democrat. And it was clear to me that he had an ambition to run for Congress on the Republican ticket at some point. And I was still thinking that someday that might be my future, Congress, as a Democrat. And I was troubled by the potential conflict there. My perhaps standing in the way of his getting the nomination or something of that sort. And it just seemed like a good time for me to think about going out on my own, which I did. And I opened a small office at 709 Market Street in Camden. I had an office in the basement of this particular building, and I remember one of the good friends that I had came in and saw the place. He said, "Geez," he said, "you're the first lawyer I ever knew who practiced in a dungeon." It wasn't quite that bad, but it was. I could see the feet of people walking past our windows. Anyway, I stayed there for about a year, and by then had run into a young man named Clarence Reber-Kenny, Reberkenny, Reber-Kenny. And we were both on the look for something that would improve the chances of our futures. And so we decided to go in together, which we did. And we opened an office on the 7th floor of the Wilson building at Broadway and Cooper Streets in Camden. And it was just one floor below the gentleman that you and I talked about a little while ago, Samuel P. Orlando, who had his office right above us. So I felt that we were in great company. And it was a rather distinguished place to be at that time. But after 2 or 3 years there, I guess I got the itch again to do something by way of expansion. and began to talk to several of the more senior fellows in the original firm that I had joined in Camden. By then they had lost a couple of people, and I thought they might be a good prospect for a merger. And in fact, that came about. We built a office building on Cooper Landing Road in Cherry Hill, and formed a firm under the name of Hyland and Reberkenny. Now, Hyland, Reberkenny, and Davis. And practiced there for several years before I got the itch again to do something different, and joined a firm in North Jersey. I'm groping for the name now. Anyway, the firm in North Jersey is the one to which I committed myself, and we practiced together for about 15 or 20 years. I had shown an interest in that firm for several reasons, one of which a good friend, Dickinson Debevoise, who later became a federal judge, was a senior partner there. And Alexander Waugh was of counsel, and after his retirement from the bench, and we had been good friends. So it just seemed like a natural evolution for me, and I enjoyed my association with that firm very, very much.
Carpenter. Yeah. When you start out as a lawyer, you just handle whatever comes in the door. When did you start getting a reputation for specializing in particular areas of the law?
I suppose several years after I joined the firm in North Jersey, some people that I knew in the utility business, water company in particular, asked me to do some of their work. And that gradually led to more and more specializing in the field of water and eventually electric and telecommunication utilities. And that became a large part of my portfolio.
What were the types of cases that you would handle? I assume some of them would be somewhat technical, and others might be more generic types of issues.
Well, I guess the threshold case would typically be a rate case, with a company filing a new tariff for increased or modified rates in some particular. And we would prepare very seriously for those cases because they were generally hotly contested by a lawyer for the public, which got to be known as rate counsel. And rate counsel would come in pretty well prepared and with the funds that would permit it to retain expert witnesses on various aspects of the rate structure. So we had to be well prepared ourselves, and it took a lot of time, but it was work that I enjoyed very much.
Let's shift, at least for the moment, back to politics from your legal career. You had mentioned early in your career that you had thought about a potential run for Congress. When did the sort of political bug again surface, and and what were the circumstances?
The perennial congressman from our district, Camden County and its surrounding area, was Charles A. Wolverton, who had been there for many, many years. And he was a good friend, although a political rival, but a good friend of my grandmother, Emma Hyland. And through her, I got introduced to him, and we became friendly, to the point that he told me in confidence that he would let me know if he had decided not to run again. Well, that would be very valuable information to have if it came to my attention. And sure enough, he called to say he wasn't going to run again. He said, "Bill, get your petitions signed and get them filed, and you'd have a good shot to, as a Democrat, I think the district is beginning to turn over." Well, this meant that Joan and I had to talk very seriously about whether we were going to do something that dramatic. And we did talk for several hours one night. And the more we talked, the more I realized, because by then we had 4 children, that it wasn't going to be a very good thing for them. And it would be tough on my wife. And so I decided quite reluctantly that I'd give up any thought of going to Congress unless it came along at a much later stage for me. And I turned to other more local pursuits, and felt very comfortable with the decision that Joan and I had made.
In those days, apart from your family connections, particularly through Emma Hyland's prominence, how did you pay your political dues? Was it working in campaigns? Was it trying to raise money? Probably that was not as significant a factor then as it is today.
Yeah.
But how do you move up the ladder politically?
Well, doing all of those things. I had begun I think that might be my sister.
Oh, okay. Take one break. General, we were talking about the old days and how you sort of moved forward politically. When you talked about just working in campaigns and doing the typical work that is needed in politics. Anything else?
I think the first thing that I did for the Democratic Party was to write speeches for some of its candidates. This would have been in the I'm not sure of the date, but in the Harry Truman days, and I wrote quite a few, and we would put them on radio, and then I joined the Camden County Speakers Bureau and would get assigned to speak at different Democratic gatherings in various parts of the county. I was glad to do it for a couple of reasons, including the fact that it got some attention for me for future purposes, And that is, if I decided to run for something, I would not be unknown to the Democratic leaders in the lower part of the county. And then we began to hold fundraising dinners at the Latin Casino in Cherry Hill, I guess it was, or Pensauken. And that was a much easier and more satisfying way to raise money than what we hear about today, because we would typically run a $100 dinner and ask people to buy tickets to that. And they did. Sometimes voluntarily and others, not so happily. But those are the things that younger guys typically do, I think, to get active in politics. And I enjoyed it very much. And then I would go to the headquarters on election day and election evening, emulating what my grandmother had done for me. I would bring along different members of my family or my friends so that they could get better acquainted with the leaders of the party. And that was the sort of thing that I did.
Did you keep your hand in music at any of these events by playing occasionally?
Not at those events especially, but I still did keep my hand in music in many other ways. For example, I was a member of Local 77 of the American Federation of Musicians, and they had a open house every Thursday at the Union Hall on North 18th Street, and I would go over there and mix with a few dozen of my colleagues, friends or about to be friends, and that was a good way to get acquainted, and I did that quite often. I also did a lot of playing at night in those days. I played for all kinds of shows in the pit, so to speak, the pit band. I had some regular commitments. Every year I played in the band that supported the Ice Capades at the old Philadelphia Arena on Market Street, 42nd and Market Street.
I think the other troupe was the Ice Follies, wasn't it?
The Ice Follies was the other one, yes. And then I subbed for in some of the name bands that played the Earl Theater. They came into town, and in those days they would lose musicians because of the draft, and suddenly they would need an alto sax fella or whatever, and I got a lot of those calls, and I played the Earl Theater, and I also played WCAU on Chestnut Street, which in those days had an 18-piece house band, they called it. And they were fine musicians, and that was a way of networking, because I would get to know the fellas from those units, and if they needed somebody, they'd say, well, maybe Bill Hyland's free, and they'd give me a call, and I was very glad to keep busy.
How did you juggle the lawyerly responsibilities with the music, or wasn't it that difficult?
Well, either the law work or the music work was adjustable, in the sense that if I had a conflict, I very often was able to adjust it and make it for another day, or do something different from what was originally intended. So it was a stretch at times, but it always worked out.
Mm-hmm. Now, you said that you decided not to become a candidate for Congress largely because of family responsibilities. At what point did you think again about possible elected office?
Well, I became increasingly active in the party, especially in Camden County, And opportunities came along. The leader of the party in that part of the state was George E. Bruner, the mayor of Camden. And from time to time, I would have a conversation with him about what I might be doing in the future. And he opened the door for me a number of times. I became a delegate to the national conventions on at least 2 occasions. And Mayor Bruner was in large part responsible for that. He also had a lot to do with my becoming a Speaker of the General Assembly, because in those days the Democratic Party in New Jersey was largely run by Bruner in Camden, Willentz in Middlesex, Carey in Essex, Thorne Lord in Mercer, and George Bruner knew all those fellows, of course, and he was kind enough to push me along on a number of instances, and that's I was put out in front of some older, more senior Democrats when I became Speaker of the Assembly, for example, largely with the help of Mayor Bruner.
Let's talk about your first running for the Assembly before you became Speaker.
Yeah, that would have been 1953, if I have my years right. Anyway, it was the year that Bob Miner ran for the governorship. And the Assembly delegation in Camden County had been Republican up to that point. But 2 other Democrats and I ran as a unit that year, and we were elected. And I took my seat on the same day that Bob Miner was sworn in as governor, I guess, or just about the same.
When did you first meet Bob Miner?
In the course of the earlier stages of that campaign. And I was very impressed with him. He was a strong fellow with a big voice and a good vocabulary, and I liked the things that he believed in.
Of course, he was elected somewhat surprisingly as a Democratic governor after a fairly long period of Republican control. Were you surprised at that election?
I don't recall one way or the other. I was hopeful, and I guess more hope than confidence at that point. But in any event, he was elected, and I don't know the margin anymore or anything like that. But
who were the key people in the Assembly that you got to know, leaders and others that you developed a relationship with?
Well, strangely, the first one that comes to mind was Bill Barnes from Essex County, the Republican leader. He was majority leader at that when I got to know him, and we became good friends, and we were very helpful to one another because the camaraderie in those days, I think, was inspiring. We didn't have the kind of bitterness that has characterized state and national politics in recent years. So much so that I am confident that I would not have been anxious or even willing to run for elective office if we had that kind of an atmosphere. But I remember Barnes and Billy Musto from Hudson County.
A very colorful character.
Oh, yes, yes. He was a very good legislator, too. Got into trouble later on, but He sure knew his politics. Had Tom Swick and you know quite a few others of different levels of ability, but there were some outstanding men and a few women, very few women in those days.
Were there any major issues that stick in your mind now in your first years in the Assembly?
Yeah, there was, of course, always a revenue problem. And so we took different positions at different points on whether we should enact a sales tax, and eventually we did, whether we should enact an income tax, and eventually we did. And I'm not, as I look back on those days, I'm not at all ashamed to say that I voted for those revenue-raising measures because I have very little respect for what I call the free lunch crowd, those that believe that we can do all of these things through government without, at some point, paying the freight.
Of course, Governor Minor was known as a very conservative, particularly on fiscal matters, Democrat. Did that bring you into some conflict with his positions?
No, not at all. Maybe I was falling into line and adopting his philosophy in many regards. And it was good. I admired his policies very much, and I think he was a darn fine governor.
What was he like in terms of personal style in dealing with the legislature and individual legislators? Was it hands-on or through staff, or how did he handle it?
Oh, no, it was hands-on. Hands-on, he was very affable. I think that he could influence people readily with the force of his conviction and his intelligence and his vigor. He was a vigorous guy. Played tennis very, very regularly. And one of his tennis companions was his early secretary, Brendan Byrne, who later became governor.
Do you recall your first contact with Brendan Byrne?
Yes, I do. It wasn't notable. It was just a nice, friendly meeting. And he was seen as the guy who worked with Minor in a very constructive way, and we admired and respected Brendan in those days, and throughout the coming years. I was very fond of him as a governor, for example.
Another name that has become significant from those early Minor years is Joseph Weintraub. What are your memories of Weintraub, first as governor's counsel and later on the Supreme Court?
Yes, we became great friends. And I recall, for example, when he retired, he was struck with the fact that suddenly he didn't have any staff to do things, to drive him or to do this. And he was expressing his disappointment that he no longer had the same secretary who could read his handwriting and when he wrote out an opinion or something. And I said, well, whatever I called him in those days, Joe, I think I called him in those days, why don't you turn that over to me and I'll get my secretary to transcribe it for you. And he did, and I still have his handwritten notes for that particular speech or opinion, whatever it was. I didn't withhold it for any reason. It's just that he never picked it up again, I guess.
There's one side anecdote I have is that when I clerked for the state Supreme Court in his last year as Chief Justice, right before he retired, and I was told on good authority that occasionally when one of the associate justices, and I won't name names, had trouble writing an opinion on a particular case that he was assigned, the Chief Justice would write the opinion himself in the style of the associate justice and send it to him and say, sign this and issue it on your own on your own name, and that no one would know the difference.
I'm not surprised. Joe Weintraub was a brilliant lawyer and an extremely capable justice. He had some viewpoints that are a little surprising. For example, he was in favor of a mandatory retirement at the age of 65 for the judiciary. I don't know whether that was ever imparted to you, but yes, he talked to me several times about that and was really charged up with the fact that I think he had run into a couple of judges or justices who were over the hill chronologically and physically, and it made him think perhaps in an extreme way about a remedy.
Going back to your assembly career, describe how you advanced within the institution of the assembly into the leadership.
Well, once again, I think behind the scenes there was the help of Mayor Brunner, and I also was very friendly with Thorne Lord from Mercer County and with Dave Willentz from Middlesex, who had known and been a contemporary of my grandmother. Dave Willentz was in politics at a young age, and my grandmother was in politics at an older age. And the two of them overlapped and were good friends. And
well, I think you're implying that the bosses at that time had such influence within the legislature that they essentially could call the shots on the leadership, even though the votes were from the assembly members themselves. Is that true?
They ran the show. Morris Brady, who was one of the more colorful figures from Hudson County, who later became a speaker of the assembly, used to say, Johnny wouldn't like that. John Kenney, Johnny wouldn't like that. Or Johnny wants me to do, he'd have a sheepish grin, Johnny wants me to do this. And he would do it. And that wasn't bad, because those guys were something special, as I think about it. They, were rough-hewn in some respects, but doggone it, they really knew government. They really knew politics. And I think that for the most part, and I don't say that there weren't some flaws, but for the most part, they were genuinely interested in doing the right thing.
Was there ever an instance where the bosses on the outside had decided, either from a regional standpoint or their own perspective, that a particular person, for example, should be elected speaker, but that there was an internal revolt within the assembly saying, well, we know this guy and he's just a dodo, we don't want him as our leader?
I don't know of anything like that.
What about your own sort of path to leadership? I assume that started with committee assignments and so forth. Were even those decisions influenced from the outside by the bosses?
Not very often, at least in my case. Mayor Brunner largely left it to me and the other two assemblymen in our delegation to come to our own decision about things. He certainly assumed that we were aware of party positions and that we would attempt to act in a manner that was consistent with those positions.
At that time, what influence did the governor have in leadership elections and decisions, if any?
Oh, I think he had a great deal of influence. Now there came a point that differences arose between the county leaders, or some of them, and Governor Minor, for example. And whatever Minor wanted, they didn't want. And that was a factor that entered into the way I was being sized up by some as a potential candidate for governor. I was not aspiring, I was not agitating for that. But Mayor Brunner and a couple of others were urging me to run and doing things behind. Ed Patton, for example, who was our Secretary of State, was one of my champions, and I didn't really, I wasn't aware of it.
What were the reasons for the splits of the county chairs with the governor?
Probably more often than not, it would be over appointments. Mm-hmm. Let's say that Dave Wilentz would want X to go on the county bench or whatever, and he was known to some of the others. I'm not coming up with a very good illustration, but more often than not, I would say it was differences over appointments.
Of course, there's also the infamous incident, I guess, at the National Convention in 1960, where Governor Minor was the favorite son of the New Jersey delegation, the convention which nominated John Kennedy. What are your recollections of the sort of national politics and Governor Minor's role at that time?
Governor Minor didn't prevail in his own ambition, I think, to be on the national ticket, and that perhaps had been because he had developed, because some animosities had arisen between him and some of our other county leaders. And he was out of favor with one or more of those, some of them vehemently opposed to whatever Minor wanted. So his future was, on a national scale, was very, very limited.
Did you understand what his strategy was at that time? There was some, I guess, talk from the outside that he was angling somehow for the vice president, or he was trying to keep the convention from going to Kennedy, in the thought that maybe Adlai Stevenson, who was a relative of his wife's family, would somehow be turned to in potentially a deadlocked convention. What was your sort of perspective on that?
I don't remember much about it. As you describe it, it probably is a valid story, but I wasn't very close to anything that would bring it back to me at this point.
In any event, there were stories at the time and after that Bobby Kennedy particularly held a grudge for the rest of his life against Governor Minor for not releasing the New Jersey delegation
I've heard
at that convention.
Yeah. I've heard that story.
General, talk a little bit more about that gubernatorial election year and your own role and who was standing where.
Well, Bob Minor had never turned to me and said, "Bill, I want you to succeed me," or anything of that kind. But I do recall at the end of a particular cabinet meeting that Ed Patton, our Secretary of State, came out, saw me, and said, "Bill, the governor really wants you to succeed him. Do you know that?" I said, "Well, I not really. Maybe a little newspaper talk, but it's never been broached to me, at least." He said, "Well, that's the way it is." He said, "and you ought to be aware of that." I said, "Okay, thank you for telling me." And that was the sort of thing that would come to my attention from time to time. I didn't take it too seriously, and I didn't let it carry me in any direction that I otherwise wouldn't have gone in, because I was very unsure that I wanted to do something like that. I sometimes, as Joan and I would talk about it, would reflect on the fundraising obligations, the need, to raise all kinds of money to finance your, and then there was also the effect that it would have on the family. We had a wonderful married life for almost 65 years, and I wouldn't have given up a day of that life for a year of being governor or something else like that. And I don't feel any sorrow over that. I'm not disappointed in any way. I truly am not. And I've been a very happy-go-lucky guy, and that's the way I hope it will always be.
Well, as you implied, the power of the county bosses at that time was significant, and most histories have suggested that the bosses eventually got together and decided that Dick Hughes would become the Democratic nominee.
Yeah.
And of course he was elected. And talk about your next sort of career move in relation to Governor Hughes after he gets inaugurated.
Well, we became acquainted after he had gone off the bench. And we talked about our common roots, because he was from or connected to Florence, New Jersey, where I had and still have close relatives. And we also, talked about his relationship to Burlington in this county. And we were just a couple of Irishmen that got along beautifully from the word go. And he became quite supportive of what I wanted to do, whatever it was. And legislatively, he was friendly toward things that I might be interested in, and I was very much influenced by the things that he was interested in. And we had a lot of laughs and a lot of good times. We did a lot of traveling together with Dick and with Betty. And Betty was really enamored with my wife's voice and would get her to sing Getting to Know You over and over. Because she had the lead, and Joan had the lead in that show. And Betty and Dick came down to hear her performance. And in all kinds of places, on all kinds of occasions, Betty would say, "Joan, what's that song that I like?" She knew what it was. "What's that song that I like?" And Joan would say, "You mean Getting to Know You?" "Oh, yes, yeah, that's it. Will you please sing that for us?" And Joan would, and she was sick and tired of it. But, you know, no one said no to Betty.
Did either of you appear on her radio show?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
What was that like?
Both of us did. Oh, that was a lot of fun. You know, it was catch as catch can, because it was never well rehearsed. But she carried the tempo. She set the tempo of the show very adroitly, and it was just fun to sit there and watch her.
Was it sort of a Regis and Kelly type show of the time, or how did she structure the format?
I'm sorry.
Was the show basically an interview show, or was it just free form conversation? Or
I guess it was mainly an interview show, but she also had performers. She had She would invite people to come on and sing or play or recite or whatever. And she was also a great storyteller herself. And it wouldn't take much to have Betty set off in an anecdotal direction at some point, and it was always amusing. And she laughed a great deal at her own stories, but she made other people laugh too.
During one of our other interviews with Ray Bateman, he told the story about being in the hospital, I think Thomas Jefferson in Philadelphia, at the same time that Governor Hughes was in the hospital upstairs in the celebrity suite. And Betty Hughes coming down to visit Ray in his room, and he was in there, I think, for heart condition, and wheeling Ray up to the floor where Governor Hughes was, and they had a full pitcher of martinis, and they would drink for the rest of the day in Governor Hughes's hospital room. And he described Governor Hughes as his closest friend in politics.
Yeah, I guess he was. Ray was a very nice guy, very easy to get along with. And I'm sure that Dick Hughes admired most people. He got along with most people. You know, there were a few that, I remember one guy, a Democrat, who was a congressman, and Dick Hughes said to me, he said, "I hope that so-and-so runs for governor so I can vote against him." He really couldn't stand the guy.
At what point did he ask you to join his cabinet as president of the Public Utilities Commission, which is now the Board of Public Utilities?
You know, I don't have any real recollection of that. He called me Billy all the time. He probably just picked up the phone and said, "Hey, Billy, I've got a vacancy on the PUC. Would you be interested in doing that?" I would say yes or no.
Do you remember any major problems or issues during your tenure on the PUC?
No, not major problems. We made a lot out of a few rate reductions that I was able to negotiate with New Jersey Bell Telephone or others, South Jersey Gas, and we really beat the drum on those things and did the arithmetic, counted up, how many dollars had been saved and so on. It was more spin than spunk.
Governor Hughes is in office for 8 years. Any other anecdotes? Of course, one of the most significant events down in your old neighborhood in South Jersey was the Soviet summit that he hosted at Glassboro College.
Yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah, well, he was very proud of that, of course. And it was a great event for South Jersey and for the country, I think.
Who were the other significant people in the Hughes administration?
I'm hesitating, and I don't want to denigrate that group of people by hesitating. I just can't recall.
Mm-hmm. As Governor Hughes is leaving office, what do you recall about the political makeup of the time which eventually led to the election of Governor Cahill? And when did you first meet Bill Cahill, who was again a Camden?
Well, Bill Cahill and I, through our families, knew each other very well. We lived just a few doors from each other. Our kids went to the same school together. And I liked Bill Cahill. I think he was very affable, a lot of fun, and I think a good governor. I'm sure he tried very hard to be a good governor because he was that kind of a person.
There were others from Camden who were in his administration, like Joe McCrane, Paul Sherwin, who played significant roles. Did you have any personal contact with them?
Oh yes, very much so. I remember being put on the spot by Paul Sherwin's family when he was slated to go to jail, and I had just been appointed Attorney General. And one of the family members appeared at our front door and pleaded with me to show mercy. And I tried to handle it in a very offhand, arm's length fashion. But yes, that struck very close to home. And the same thing with Joe McCrane, whom I had known for years.
I'm going to cut first, just break. Okay. General, we talk about Joe McCrane. Of course, before Governor Cahill was elected, he was, I believe, the general manager of the Garden State track in Cherry Hill, which was established by his father-in-law, Eugene Morey. And there was talk at that time about the Phillies coming over from Philadelphia and building a stadium next to the Garden State racetrack in Cherry Hill, which eventually became the core of the sports complex that was established in the Meadowlands. What do you recall of those days and those negotiations with the Phillies before the Meadowlands became a viable idea?
Well, Joe Kokel was a senator from Camden County, and we did a lot of political and legal things together. And I encouraged Joe Kogel to bring about some legislative accomplishments for South Jersey, which could include bringing the Phillies over. And Joe was, quite willing to do that, to try it. And we eventually Don, I just don't remember enough of that to go on with it. But
well, the limited knowledge I have is that Bob Carpenter, who was the owner of the Phillies, was very interested in moving over, and I think there was actually some land purchased next to the racetrack for a potential stadium site.
And we actually passed some legislation too.
Right, and that it was a fairly significant project that almost came to fruition, and then I think later Philadelphia, which had resisted building a new stadium for the Phillies, sort of lowered its opposition and essentially, built the Phillies a new park.
Yeah. Listen, I can walk in there and ask those people
that's right.
to go elsewhere.
Let me just take a break. General, talk about the role of Eugene Morey, who was Joe McCrane's father-in-law and the owner of the Garden State track in Cherry Hill, as well as the Hialeah track in Florida. What was he like?
Well, he was a very dynamic businessman who had made a great deal of successful investments in South Jersey, particularly down in Cumberland County in the Vineland area where he was from. And as things moved along, there became a time when some interest in building a baseball stadium in Cherry Hill got on the table. And that was very appealing to Senator Kogel and to me as legislators, because it enhanced the position of the county and was likely to be very profitable for local interests. And as things developed and Joe Kogel was running for re-election to the Senate, his opponent was Fred Scholes, of a bank executive, and I thought it was just a front for Morey. So at one of the $200 or $100, whatever it was, played fundraising dinners that we had at the Latin Casino, I wrote a parody for a couple of our young Democrats to sing, and they did. And it went to the tune of "That's Amore."
Dean Martin song.
Yeah, that's right. When you vote for Fred Scholes, now when you go to the polls and vote for Fred Scholes, you get Morey. And it was good for a few laughs and a few enemies.
Well, during the Cahill administration, apart from the problems he ran into with allegations concerning fundraising and others that affected both his administration and some of the political people at that time. There's also a lot of talk about organized crime influence in New Jersey. Governor Cahill was an ex-FBI agent, but it became a significant issue about the mafia involved in New Jersey and control of industries like garbage collection and disposal. And in response to this, the legislature creates the State Commission of Investigation. Tell us about that and your role in the establishment of the commission.
All right, it became one of the principal issues in Dick Hughes' campaign, because he was accused of doing nothing about all of these things, and he said, "Yeah, but I support it, and we've created this State Commission of Investigations with a principal emphasis on organized crime." And yeah, but Governor Hughes, you don't even have a chairman for that thing, that commission. He says, "Well, I have a couple of fellows in mind." Well, one of them, unfortunately, was myself. And he began to, along with Bob Burkhart and a couple others of his entourage, began to pressure me to take on this chairmanship. And I didn't want to do it because I had just gotten off the Public Utility Commission, I guess it was, and sort of promised my wife that we would have an uneventful, more fruitful life for a while. And here this thing came along. So I recall quite clearly, I can't give you the year, but I can tell you that it was Christmas Eve. And that's when people like Dick Hughes go swing into action. He was out in Hawaii, and he got on the phone and he said, "Billy," he said, "Betty Hughes is here and she tells me I ought to call you and tell you that you just have to take on the chairmanship of the SCI." By then it was known as those initials. And I said, "Dick, I can't do that. I've already promised my wife that I'm going to go into private life and stay there for a while." Well, he went on, and it was more emotional. And Joan was in the other room by then. And finally, I got off the phone and I said to her, "Joan, you'll never guess what I just did." She said, "What was that?" I said, "I told Dick Hughes I would serve as the chairman of the SCI. "Oh," she said, "you promised me." I said, "Yeah, I know. But Dick Hughes, you don't say no to Dick Hughes. Not in the long run, anyway." So we had a big ceremony. It was a four-man commission, and we had 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats. And as soon as I was appointed, the news guys began to hound me for, "Well, what have you done? What are you doing? Yeah, you were appointed 10 days ago. What have you done since then?" And I had to fudge it for, I said, "Well, we have some things under consideration." And I went back to the other commissioners. I said, "We have to do something. These guys are driving me crazy. And I think that we ought to have a big, big gathering, subpoena every hood in New Jersey and bring them in." And that's what we did. We subpoenaed Sam DeCavalcanti and Gyp DiCarlo and all those reputed mobsters. And they all descended on Trenton one day at one time. And the news guys were there with their cameras taking all kinds of pictures and writing all kinds of stories. You know, and suddenly we were on top of the pile. It just looked like we had been busy every day and night doing what we could to protect the public. And we were. But, you know, things don't fall into place as quickly as you would like sometimes. And so I didn't have the necessary go-ahead with some of the decisions that we had made, but finally we did.
Of course, there were questions about the constitutionality of this new body and whether it was fish nor fowl, was it a legislative or executive commission, whether it had constitutional authority to issue subpoenas and so forth, which eventually were resolved in the courts favorably to the commission. I believe.
Yeah, but those things don't bother the news guys, do they?
No, but there was also controversy, I guess at that time and later, about this new body undercutting the Attorney General's authority and fragmenting sort of the investigative focus of New Jersey law enforcement that you dealt with later as Attorney General.
Well, it was a very delicate relationship, and I think that we were able to negotiate the rapids and the shoals and get along with the Attorney General. That might have been, no, the name escapes me, from Middlesex County. He was a cripple. He was the Attorney General.
Arthur Sills? No.
Arthur Sills. Yeah. And he and I got along very well, and we talked a lot about these potential conflicts and the tensions between our two agencies, and we had no problem.
Talk more about the contacts with these alleged mafia bosses, and what were they like, and who were the lawyers, if you recall.
I don't remember the lawyers, but I do remember Sam DeCavalcante and the guy from Long Branch, Pussy Russo, and Gyp DiCarlo from Essex, I think he was, and a whole bunch of them like that. They were, and of course, Frank Sinatra was usually thrown in the mix by the media, and I recall coming back from a bachelor's party, not for me, but for some friend. And one of the staff guys from the SCI said, "Hey, Mr. Chairman, we were able to subpoena Frank Sinatra." I said, "You what?" "Yeah, we were, he was on shore at the Hylands or whatever it was, and we were able to subpoena him." And I blew my top. I said, "What did you do that for?" "Well, you know, you read all about it." I said, "Yeah, but what kind of evidence did we ever come across that reliably hooked him into the mobs?" "Well, okay." So we had to go through with it. And I began to negotiate with Sinatra's lawyer.
Mickey Cohn?
Yes, for how we would handle it. And I didn't tell him, but I had decided that I would not participate in the interrogation because I was embarrassed by what we had done. I just didn't want to be part of it. And so we progressed, and it was agreed that he was going to fly, I think, to West Trenton or whatever. And they would bring him in as quietly as they could, and they did. I don't think there was much media attention, if any. And I turned the gavel over to Glenn Miller, who was the assistant chairman. I said, "You've got the deck, kiddo. I'm not even going to be present." "You mean you're not going to show up when Frank Sinatra's there?" "No," I said, I'm not going to show up because Frank Sinatra's there. So anyway, that was the way I handled it. And I think I was right. And there hadn't been after that any real evidence implicating Sinatra that came to my attention.
So it was really somewhat, not inadvertent, but at least not authorized by the full commission itself to subpoena Sinatra.
Well, the staff people had general authority to do things like that.
But you would think they would ask the full commission
absolutely.
For direction.
Absolutely. And I would have said, "All right, well, tell me why." And I would not have been difficult. I just would have said, "Tell me why." And if they'd, "Well, this and that," and okay, let's do it. But nobody could tell me. Nobody could give me a reason that Sinatra was being connected, real valid reason that Sinatra was being connected to the mob.
Did you have any one-on-one contact with Sinatra, or was it mostly through the lawyers?
Mickey Cohen.
Mickey Cohen. Another issue that starts percolating while you're chairing the commission is the potential for casino gambling in Atlantic City. And there was a legislative committee chaired by Frank McDermott, I believe, at the time, to consider possible referendum to authorize casino gambling. Well, at that time, I guess it was a little broader than Atlantic City alone. It was just authorizing casino gambling. You testified strongly against it. Do you recall that hearing?
I do.
Why did you feel so strongly?
Well, number one, I was concerned about whether we could control it. I had been to Las Vegas several times and was certainly aware of the fact that that was a town that became wide open for all sorts of things that I didn't want to see in New Jersey. Secondly, I just didn't have any confidence that it was going to be good for the economy of Atlantic City or New Jersey. And I think that's still a question mark.
Mm-hmm. I think you also testified that you had heard that mafia types were already organizing to try to plan for a potential role in Atlantic City. Do you recall that?
I recall saying that, and I recall being of that opinion. And I don't recall now what was the reason for that conviction, but I would not have been surprised, I suppose, because they had shown the mob guys had shown themselves to be very clever, and I would have been surprised if they had not been preparing a scenario of sorts for Atlantic City.
Mm-hmm. A couple of the areas, and I think you mentioned them briefly, that the SCI started looking into were corruption, particularly in Long Branch. You mentioned Pussy Russo as one of the identified mafia figures in Long Branch. and also the garbage industry. Anything specific that you wanted to talk about on those investigations?
No, I think those transcripts would have to speak for themselves. I don't remember that much about it. I do remember I thought that the garbage industry was corrupt, infiltrated, I suppose I should say. And I don't recall what we did about it, but we probably fashioned some regulations or some steps that we thought would be helpful in curbing it.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're now moving toward the end of Governor Cahill's first and only term. Did you think he was in such political trouble as it came to be, or not?
I don't recall now, Don. I don't recall really being alarmed. Did he have only one term?
Mm-hmm. And he was defeated in the primary.
Who, Dick Hughes was?
No. Bill Cahill.
Oh, Cahill. Yeah. Oh, no, I didn't realize that he was in that kind of trouble. But I wasn't surprised. I think Charlie Sandman had something to do with that defeat.
Mm-hmm.
And he was very energetic and very able and very ambitious. And I guess he carried the day.
Mm-hmm. What personal contacts did you have with Sandman, if any?
Very few, although we knew each other quite well, being from South Jersey. And but not too many. I didn't have any relationship with him of any sort.
Well, in that 1973 election year that leads to Brendan Burns' election as governor, what was your role?
What was my
role? What did you do during the 1973 campaign?
Campaign for in which Byrne ran.
Mm-hmm.
I attempted to raise some money, I'm sure, of a modest nature, because I was never a very serious fundraiser. And I do recall being part of a small group, 3 or 4 people, that used to meet in the office along the turnpike of the UAW, I guess it was. And we interviewed different prospects for the governorship. Ed Crable was one of them. Brendan was another.
Dick Coffey?
Dick Coffey, yes, very active. And
some of the Byrne people, like Dick Leone, actually started with the Coffey campaign.
I did, too.
Did you? Mm-hmm.
Yep. And then we negotiated a transition, a turnover of names, for the list of mailing lists and things like that. And, I remember being at those meetings very vividly. I'm correct in saying it was the UAW, am I not?
Probably. Would that have been Joel Jacobson's?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And Joel was part of that group of senior citizens, like myself.
I mentioned Dick Leone. What was your first contacts with him? Was it at that time or earlier?
In point of time, I couldn't tell you, but I do remember him very well. He was extremely able and articulate and honest. I liked him very much. I got acquainted with his family. Kate, I think was the name of his daughter. And I liked Dick, and I supported him in his quest for the U.S. Senate, and felt that he was not treated very fairly. Yeah.
Well, after Congressman Sandman gets nominated as the Republican nominee, did you think it was then going to be easy for the Democrats, particularly at the gubernatorial level, to win?
Well, I thought that Charlie Sandman was so far south physically that would be a liability for the Republicans, and I guess it was. He wasn't that well known or that well liked in North Jersey.
And of course, he'd been a defender of President Nixon during the Watergate scandal.
That's right. But he was an interesting guy and a nice guy. I enjoyed his company.
Well, in any event, Brendan Byrne does get elected in the November election. What role did you have during the transition from Cahill to the Byrne administrations?
I was one of 3 or 4 individuals on the so-called transition committee. And I remember telling a couple of my partners, I said, "No, don't be concerned about this. I'm not going anywhere. As a matter of fact, I'm anxious to do this so that I won't be tempted to do more." I don't know whether that made much sense, but in my mind it was a reason for being part of the committee. And I enjoyed getting well acquainted with Luke Hayden and Dick Leone. And I don't know whether there were any more than that, plus myself. Maybe not. Was that the transition committee, Don, or was it? Am I missing somebody?
Well, I think Dave Goldberg, actually Bob Willents. There was a large group, but there probably was an internal committee that was much smaller.
Yeah, well, they were in and out of things, but I think it was the 3 of us, as I said, that spent more time in Trenton on the problems.
One of the issues that comes up during the transition, which later you would have a much more significant role, was the sports complex, which originated during the Cahill administration from Joe McCrane and others who were pushing for the sports complex. But during the transition, it appeared that the financing was collapsing because of the opposition from New York, led by Governor Rockefeller, and his brother, David, who was then the chairman of the Chase Manhattan Bank, keeping the New York financial people from investing in the bonds for the sports complex. Did you have any role in those negotiations with the Giants to reshape the contract for them to move to New Jersey?
No, I did not.
Okay.
I think Sonny Werblin was a big factor.
Right. Well, now that you mentioned Sonny Werblin again, talk about him as a personality and his style.
Well, he was a real go-go guy, very energetic, very interested in the goals that he had set for himself. And he nice guy. I liked him very much. We got along beautifully. He had a lot of confidence in himself, and he would go ahead and do things with a confidence that it was all going to be okay and everybody would approve of it. He was a good force for New Jersey, although he had very strong roots in Manhattan, too.
And with Republicans like Ronald Reagan, who was one of his
Yeah.
most loyal clients when he was a Hollywood agent.
Yep. Yeah.
Well, and at what point was there talk about you becoming Attorney General? Was that something that was kept inside the transition, and when did you first sort of hear of that in either unofficial or official communication?
I think it was largely inside discussion. I don't recall that anything seriously got into the newspapers about it perhaps being under consideration. And I didn't know that I was for sure, but I must have told Brendan Byrne at some point that I would be interested if he was of a mind to it. That led to a funny exchange. I was annoyed after we had reached the point that my name was being considered, that different, obscure, off-the-wall names were being floated by Brendan or by somebody on his behalf. Some, people who weren't even New Jersey. And I can't think of any of those names right now, but...
Well, Elliot Richardson was one.
Elliot Richardson was one of them. And I thought, what in the world is, what's going on here? And so we had a press conference. It was down on the first floor of the State House. Brendan, myself, and a half a dozen newsmen. And one of them said to Brendan, who have you been considering as Attorney General? And I'm sitting right there. He said, there was, and he named Elliot Richardson and 3 or 4 or 5 other people. And then he said, and Bill Hyland, but Bill was not my first choice. And so I was waiting for the opportunity to pay him back. And one of the news guys fortunately asked me, who was your choice for governor, Mr. Hyland? And I said, well, eventually it was Brendan, but he wasn't my first choice. Well, they thought that was great, And I was even. It's hard to stay even with Brendan, but I was even for the moment.
What do you recall of when he actually asked you to be Attorney General?
It might have been on that occasion, not at that moment, not in the presence of newsmen or anything. But at some point, I'm sure he said words to the effect that, Bill, would you be interested in doing this? And are you going to be able to do it? You're going to give up your law, usual questions that you would expect. And I guess I gave the right answers because he said, well, fine, let's do it. And he announced it. And
of course, he gets elected, at least partially, on a platform of being a former prosecutor and judge and the man who couldn't be bought, according to the mafia tapes, and on the heels of scandals both within the state and on the national level with the Watergate scandal. So I guess it was obvious that a major priority of his administration had to be keeping out of the problems that had affected the Cahill administration or any taint of corruption or scandal. How did you handle that, or did you discuss that specifically, or was it so obvious that it was, an understanding that this had to be the major priority of the administration?
I think there was an understanding that it had to be, because we talked about different things that ought to be done that would put us in a good position on that issue or those issues. Yeah, it was, we talked about government under glass and a few things like that. And I remember saying, government under glass and no seeing eye dogs.
Did you have any personal priorities that you wanted to accomplish as Attorney General?
Well, okay, I don't want to. I wanted the state to be more highly regarded than it was, and deservedly. So that meant that we had to clean up our reputation, and there just could not be any breath of scandal. And we tried pretty hard to do it that way. And, I always had confidence that when I would say something moving in that direction, that Brendan would be right there with me. I wouldn't have to urge him, I wouldn't have to argue him into a position that, for those who believed in the same things, would be quite obvious. Mm-hmm. And we got along beautifully. The only really bad moment we had was when the Attorney General's staff came up with information that led me to believe I had no choice but to indict Ed Cradwell, who was the newly appointed Secretary
of State.
And that caused me great pain because I knew Ed and I liked him. But, there it was when Pete Richards and Ed Steer, who were two highly respected staff people, came to me and we talked over and over what the evidence was, what the grand jury had before it. And they would say, General, I don't see how we can do anything but ask for an indictment here. And I went along with it. And I don't mean to put what blame, if any, there is on them, because I was totally committed to what they were telling me. But it made me terribly sad.
Of course, later, just to finish the story, he took a leave of absence from the cabinet, but then the charges were ultimately dismissed on grounds of statute of limitations.
Yeah. The head of our criminal justice section by then was Matt Boylan. And Matt was very thorough and sometimes very slow. And this just dragged on and dragged on and dragged on. And that contributed to the ruling eventually that we had failed within the statute of limitation to show that an indictment was justified. I was, so mad about that because I knew that what it did was put the whole issue on the wrong basis, a technicality like that. It just got away from, as a matter of substance, were we correct in doing what we did, because it was a man's life, and were we justified? Well,
of course, one of the issues that came to dominate that first term, both for Governor Byrne and for you as Attorney General, was the litigation relating to the Robinson Cahill school funding case. Any anecdotes about the process of that litigation, which would go on for years? after you left the AG's office?
No, I really don't think I have anything to contribute to that. I believe that Luke Hayden argued that.
At least one of the arguments, and I think Governor Byrne himself personally went over to the Supreme Court on one of those arguments.
I think that's right. Yeah, so we attached great importance to it, and took our best shot at persuading the court at whatever.
And of course, there was some early criticism of the court in some of its decisions that it was allowing the legislature too much time to confront the problem, and then finally the court cracked down a little bit and set that deadline of closing the schools. Another case that you got national attention for was the Karen Ann Quinlan right to die case, in which you argued as Attorney General in the trial court and on appeal, I believe.
Yeah,
talk about that in the context of the Quinlan case. Now, there's been so much written about it, but if you can shortcut it a little bit.
Well, that was for me a very, very difficult case too, because I took a lot of abuse from the Catholic hierarchy, the unofficial hierarchy, meaning the parish priest and others that were on the scene. I took a lot of criticism for refusing to go along with the family. And I think I was right, and I think the Supreme Court was wrong in jumping so quickly into what it did.
Why don't you explain a little bit, for the record, what the issues were in the context of their decision?
Well, was the issue that the court had to deal with was whether I'm searching for words now, Don.
Well, Karen Ann Quinlan was in what I think they described as a vegetative state.
Yes.
And could not communicate. Her father, I believe, had been appointed as guardian for her.
Her adoptive father.
And that he had then gone to court, I believe, asking as guardian, since she could not communicate, to be authorized to turn off the artificial machines that were keeping her alive, and which presumably would lead to her death if turned off. And then the opponents to that, who were obviously people who believed that her life was sacred, were opposing his request to the court. And then the state intervened to take a position that you argued for the state.
I felt fundamentally that the issue was one that should have been decided by the legislature and not by a court. And I still have very strong feelings in that direction, because if the legislature had assumed the role that I think it should have had, it could have had hearings, it could have had expert testimony come in, it could have done a number of things that we all recognize as legitimate tools of a judicial decision. And those things didn't happen because what I know from what Dick Hughes has told me, that he and Betty were in Florida. And she said, in effect, by golly, Dick, you're not going to get out of here until that case is decided unanimously. putting words in her mouth. But I'm repeating what Dick said to me. He said, "Oh, Betty really gave me a bad time about that, you know." She just thought that was cruel for that poor little girl. Well, that poor little girl had a history, had a background that was not the very best. She was on drugs and other things, and that all contributed to her condition. So while I could feel sorry for the result, I also was influenced by what I knew that Karen had done.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the Supreme Court reversed the lower court's decision and held that there was a right to privacy that did allow the adoptive father as guardian acting in presumably her stead to direct that the machines be turned off. And that decision has been criticized over the years, and some people have defended it. But you said that you would have preferred a legislative approach rather than a judicial approach.
Very much.
And of course, they based it on the right to privacy, which has been controversial itself in other areas because of its lack of really clear position in the Constitution, either the state or federal constitutions.
Yep.
Any other sort of memories of the trial and the arguments, or?
No, nothing significant enough to mention.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've mentioned some of the people you brought into the Department of Law and Public Safety, your team. How did you go about assembling that team of your key people?
Well, I had a knowledge of many of them from practicing law with them. Matt Boylan, whom I brought in as the head of the Criminal Justice Division, I knew because Matt was a great guy for picking up the phone and talking to you incessantly about something, which he did. And I became very friendly with Matt and his wife and admired him very, very much. He was a little too bombastic, a little bit too something or other for that role, as it turned out. Mm-hmm. But he had a great education and had good academic achievements, and it just didn't work. He was not a good administrator.
Bob Del Tufo was another one that you brought in. Talk about Bob.
Well, Bob was brought to my attention by Brendan Byrne. And I did not know Bob otherwise, but very quickly we developed a closeness that persists to this day, although like any relationship, it gets a little tattered and torn sometime, because he ran for governor in the primary, and I wasn't able to do as much as I wanted to for him, for circumstances that I tried to explain to him, but I'm not too sure that I was very persuasive. But aside from that, he is one of the most talented, extraordinary guys I've ever met. And we had a great relationship. We had a lot of good times together. And we enjoyed what we were doing together. And we worked very hard at trying to fashion the standards under which we would operate. And he was quite helpful in that regard. He had been a clerk for Joe Weintraub, and Joe had been very open in telling me what he thought of Bob Del Tufo.
Another one was Steve Skillman, who I believe was there before, or not?
Before. Yeah, in fact, let's see. Steve, I think, was so talented and had such a good reputation that it spoke for itself. No one else had to speak for him, and I remember going to him even before I took office, probably, to say, Steve, I certainly hope that you're going to be able to stay in your role. And I forget what he was at that point, but I said, you should be the first Assistant Attorney General if you aren't already. Mm-hmm. And we had just an excellent relationship, and I have the greatest admiration for him. Ted Winard was another one who was there. You know, I didn't have to go out and search for him. Ted was there, and my job was simply to learn more about those people so I could make up my own mind about where they stood and what they should be doing in my administration. Mm-hmm. But there were some others that I brought in, like Roger Schwartz, who is a very talented young guy who, there are few, if any, who know the legislative process as well as Roger does. And we got along famously. Paul
Levy? Paul Levy?
Paul Levy is another fellow that I brought in, but on somebody else's recommendation. I didn't know Paul. And I forget who recommended him now, but I brought him in, I met with him, I talked to him, I soon became convinced that he was the right fellow for that position. And he did a great job.
One of the initiatives that Brendan Byrne pursued in that first term was the creation of the Department of Public Advocate, which became headed by Stan Van Ness, former governor's counsel in the Hughes administration. Did that create any turf issues with the Department of Law and Public Safety, in the sense that you had this other sort of legal entity mandated to go to court on certain issues, and also with quite a bit of autonomy to do what it wished on public policy issues?
Well, the creation or the proposal to create that department created a lot of concern. These were largely turf questions. And we resolved them in favor of the policy decision that Governor Byrne had made, and that was that such a department was needed and that we ought to create it. And legislatively it was created. And Stanley Van Ness did a terrific job heading it up and establishing the ground rules for its intervention in different kinds of litigation. It was a good issue, and I think it did some good things.
Another recruit that you're said to have brought into the Byrne administration was outside your own turf, in the Department of Environmental Protection when David Bardeen was named as commissioner. Talk about your earlier relationship with David and what you conveyed to the governor and others about his potential contribution to the administration.
Well, I had gotten to know Dave through a close friendship with the name came and went. Former chairman of the Federal Power Commission, Washington guy. Anyway, he and I began to socialize quite a bit, our families as well. And in the course of doing that, I became acquainted with David Bardeen and others in that federal energy circle. And so much that I visited Dave and his wife, along with my wife, when Joan and I were in Israel on a visit. And we enjoyed each other's company, and I think we had respect for each other. And when I came back from one trip, and Brendan and I were talking about needs for his administration, I said, Brendan, there's a guy, he's now in Israel, in a important position, but he's interested in coming back to the States. He thinks that it's wrong for him to have his family living for too many years outside of the continental U.S. His name is David Bardeen. Well, tell me more about him. And I did. And then I called Dave and asked him whether a position in the Byrne administration would perhaps interest him. And he said, like what? And I talked about environmental protection. And he thought that would be very exciting. And I told that to the governor. And we brought Dave back for an interview. And sure enough, the deal was made. And he did a great job.
Mm-hmm. During that first term, there were other initiatives like reforming the penal code and parole and other sort of legal related. Now they were fairly technical, but anything you'd like to mention about those?
Not particularly, Don.
Okay.
No. While we were on the subject of outsiders coming to New Jersey, Ralph Dungan was another one. And I had gotten acquainted with him because I was invited by the Kennedy administration to come to Washington and to consider the possibility of going on the Federal Communications Commission, which I eventually decided against for the same reason that I had decided against that sort of thing in the past, that it just was not fair to Joan and our kids, which by then probably were six in number, to move out of town.
And of course, Ralph was the Chancellor of Higher Education.
That's right. That's where he was appointed. And I'm sure he did a good job, and he was a very interesting guy. And so was his wife was a very interesting person. And I think, as far as I know, I think the governor appreciated that appointment and was glad that he made it.
Mm-hmm. Of course, the governor's popularity begins fairly high because he dealt with the gasoline crisis in those first couple months of the administration with the odd-even gas plan. Any thoughts from your perspective as Attorney General about the energy crisis?
No, not especially.
I guess it was in 1976 that you were invited to perform at Waterloo Village with Benny Goodman, or maybe you invited yourself. Why don't you tell that story?
I didn't invite myself. I had no idea. I wouldn't have been bold enough to think that I could or should do that. But Percy Leach, who was the so-called proprietor, co-proprietor in those days of Waterloo Village, was very fond of music, very fond of jazz, very fond of Joan and myself. And he began to talk to Benny Goodman about my clarinet playing and said, "Benny, you ought to invite Bill to come up and play with your band at the concert on such and such a date." And Benny said, why would I want to do that? I don't know what Percy said at that point. But anyway, one thing led to another. And finally I was invited to do it. And I came out very nervously. And I'm sure that Benny was by then sorry that he had invited me to do it. He hadn't heard me play yet. And he said, "Well, what do you want to play?" I said, "Well, how about Body and Soul?" Well, it began some rather humorous, I guess, exchanges between Benny and myself. And the audience seemed to like it. So I played Body and Soul. And it was very good. It went very well, I mean. And Benny came over at that point and said to me, "Don't go yet. I want you to hang around for a while." So I said, okay. So I ended up playing for about a half hour, I guess.
So you did this without any rehearsal with him before?
That's right.
Even though he was known as a perfectionist? And
yeah, but improvisation is something that's very hard to explain to someone who isn't a musician. Ben didn't know what I'm talking about. But, you know, in terms of the exchange and rapport between Benny and myself, that would be no problem because we knew the same tunes and the same keys, and, you know, the same nod of the head means this to me and to him. And it worked out beautifully, and it developed, it inaugurated a relationship that lasted until the day of his death.
Mm-hmm. How did you keep your sort of music going during these years when you're Attorney General and when you're so active before that as a lawyer and so forth?
Well, I did some playing on my own or with so-called play-along records, rhythm sections that give you the background to improvise. And I would sit in at different places where I knew the musicians whenever I had the chance to do it. And so I kept fairly accustomed to the instrument and playing with it. And I remember playing a concert that was televised here with a concerto that had been written for me by the chief arranger of the Air Force band in Washington. He titled it something about concerto for saxophone playing clarinet or something like that. So I had to play both instruments, and that went pretty well. So, you know, there were lots of opportunities like that, and Benny and I maintained a relationship that continued right down to the time of his death. Mm-hmm. And thereafter, because he asked me to be his executor. And I said, well, I'll do that, providing you give me the name of somebody from your family that can join us, so that I have input from family members. And he suggested Shirley Dieter, who was a daughter, not a daughter, not a daughter, but a daughter-in-law. Mm-hmm. And then he did things like this. He had 7 clarinets when he died. It isn't a magic number, but that just happened to be the number that he had. He said, "Bill, I want you to take care of those horns of mine, and you know where they ought to go." So I said, "Well, okay." And I talked to him a little bit about what he wanted. And we gave one to the Smithsonian and gave one to Carnegie Hall. Gave one to each of his daughters, gave one to Yale, where he had created his archive. And finally, he said, "Be sure to take one for yourself." So I had another clarinetist come over, and I played, and I played behind a screen, and he listened to it, and he finally said, "No, that's the one that you sound best on." And I played that for about 10 years on all outside engagements and whatever. And then finally I got nervous about the care of the instrument and wanted to do something with it, so I gave it to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it's on exhibit up there in its own special little thing.
I just wanted to read an excerpt of your eulogy at his grave.
Oh.
He saw things that for most of us would have gone unnoticed. He heard in the music of others, and in the music of his own mind, sounds and symbols that were beyond our reach. But for him, that talent was more than a gift. It was a tremendous burden few of us can appreciate, a burden that relentlessly drove him to seek its outer limits.
Yeah.
I've been sadly given the privilege to be at a couple of your eulogies, and you write very good eulogies.
Well, that was a back of the envelope job on the way up to the funeral, which I could hardly believe was coming.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back to the Byrne administration. As we talked a little bit, one of the other major initiatives during that first term was the building of the sports complex after the financing had been rescued. As Attorney General, you are ex officio a member of the board of the Sports Authority. You've already mentioned a little bit Sonny Werblin as the driving force, but also a somewhat, I guess, mercurial personality and a hard-driving type of guy. I've had the feeling, in sort of talking to other people, that there was a little bit of tension, that he had been given more constraint when Governor Byrne came into office than he had during the Cahill administration in terms of oversight. Do you agree or not agree on that?
Well, it's hard for me to tell how he felt. He might have felt that way. And if I had been giving him advice, I would have said, be careful now. You know, Governor Byrne knows what he wants. And you may not have the same free and easy relationship with him as your predecessor, that you did with his predecessor. But, he's very bright. He has an open mind for good ideas and good people. And that's all you have to portray, good ideas with good people.
Mm-hmm. Any other anecdotes about those early days on building the complex and later?
No, I think I'm all talked out.
Well, you mentioned Sonny Werblin, who also had a role in a way because he was the major shareholder of Monmouth Park, which was a competitor to the new Meadowlands racetrack. Any direct talks with, I'm sorry, not Sonny Wergland, Dave Wilentz.
Dave Wilentz.
Any talks with Dave Wilentz about his feelings about the sports complex?
No, not really. David and I had lots of talks, but there weren't too many of them focused on subjects like that. For one thing, I was a bit wary of his pecuniary interest in all that stuff, and he had been very upset over the indictment of Ed Craybill, and came to me and gave me hell for that. He said, if I had been Attorney General, that never would have happened. I said, well, you're not the Attorney General. And that was the end.
Just as an aside, was your role in arguing as Attorney General in the Quinlan case the only time since he, as Attorney General, prosecuted the Lindbergh kidnapping, or don't you know? Were there other Attorney Generals who actually handled cases on their own?
I don't know.
Okay.
No.
Obviously, Brendan Burns' popularity slides after that early boost with the odd even gas plan because of the income tax. Did you think he was going to get reelected, or weren't you sure? Or
No,
and did you think he was going to even run?
Well, that was the first question. Will he run? And we weren't sure of that. But we talked privately to one another, the cabinet people or department heads or whatever, and we agreed that he couldn't possibly win. And, you know, that was a regret that we had because we admired what he had done and we were part of it. But we thought, well, there were too many issues that were on the negative side, and he's just not going to be able to recover from this. And I think one of the things that came out of the woodwork was the sense that anybody but Byrne would be the winner.
Mm-hmm.
And he showed us all to be wrong.
Of course, in a way, with some Irish luck because of the number of candidates opposing him in the primary.
That could be. That could be. But he was a darn fine governor. And, you know, there were some things that I didn't necessarily agree with. That was true with any of them. But, you know, I always had I was always given my opportunity to voice my feelings.
Do you recall any specific things that you didn't agree with?
No, not especially. I don't. You know, Don, it's been many years since I've had occasion to think about these topics, and I apologize for not being better than I was.
You're fine. Well, he does get reelected. You resign as Attorney General and return to private practice as the senior partner of one of the state's largest law firms based in Moorestown. Talk a little bit about that and, you know, becoming a private lawyer again and your other activities outside the law.
Yeah, well, I was glad to be out of the public eye. The scrutiny that one gets as Attorney General, and that's just one of a number of offices where this would also be true, is excruciating. You can't do a darn thing without being questioned as to why you did it. But I feel that I had basically an unscathed administration. There were folks that were down on me for the Quinlan case, there were folks that were down on me for the Crabeel indictment and so on. You could probably name a dozen more things. But, you know, by and large, I went home on the last day of my office feeling that it had been worthwhile. I suppose I might have served another term if I had indicated to Brendan, and I had a meeting with him. I forget just where it was now, but I had a meeting with him about it, and he said, well, would you do this or would you do that? And, you know, he wasn't asking me to do anything improper, but the question was, how long would I be willing to serve if he reappointed me? And I said, I just can't give you that kind of a commitment because it'd be too unfair to my family to say that I would be able to serve another 4 years. And I think that made him happy. I think he was ready. Brendan was ready to move on to somebody else, and that's understandable.
Well, now that you're back practicing law, talk a little bit about the profession of being an attorney and how it's changed over the years from when you first started.
Well, it has changed radically. For example, I'm still not comfortable with the advertising that lawyers do. And when I read the Law Journal or other publications, I'm still not comfortable with the emphasis on the dollar aspects of the business. So-and-so got a $298,000 verdict, and that's $3,000 better than, that sort of thing. I think we would all like to practice free from the pressures of money and peer judgment that involves what kind of verdicts did you get? How powerful are you? I think that's one reason why I was quite willing to get out of office, to leave office. After I went through the exercise of, well, would I be willing to serve another year, another 2 years? Why? And I just decided that it wasn't worth it. It wasn't to my liking to do that.
Some people have suggested that New Jersey, in contrast to most other states, at least since the 1947 Constitution, has had a relationship between the state Supreme Court and the governor, which is extremely close, and in some cases maybe in alliance against the legislature in terms of major issues like school funding, Pinelands, low-income housing, others where the court has tended to side with the executive and the governor. What's your take on that? And also because governors have appointed their own councils, other members of governor staffs, departing a bit from the old tradition where judges would work their way up and then become appointees to the Supreme Court.
Well, I think all of us know somebody or several somebodies that we think ought to have been on the court, like Steve Skillman, for example, and I did him no favor by publicly saying that I thought he would make a fine justice, because that was at a time when there was a good deal of newspaper scrutiny on appointments and who's moving up and who isn't. And it would have been better for Steve credentials just to stand on their own. He didn't need me or anybody else to push him along. But I know at least a couple guys and girls today, because we're finding that there are some excellent female lawyers, persons who could very well have been on the court if the path to that kind of an appointment were a little easier. Do you have to be in politics? That's what I remember. One of the first female justices came into my office and said to me, "Bill, what do I have to do to be recognized by my party so that perhaps I can be a judge someday?" I said, "Just get out your checkbook. Start making donations. I don't mean anything improper, but just that's one way to let them know that you're around." And it worked, I guess. But I am absolutely torn apart right now by the picture that the court is presenting of dissension and factionalism. And, I would be surprised if you don't feel very much the same way. But and I would be interested in your take on how you feel.
No, I'm the questioner today.
I realize that.
But I think it is a concern for people who have followed the court and the office of governor over the years about the current situation, no matter who you blame. But it is a distressful, I think, picture about the relationship.
Yeah.
General, before we close, why don't you talk a little bit about the family? You lost Joan a couple of years ago, but how about the rest of the family and what they're up to?
Well, I'm very, very proud of my gang, all 6 of them and all 12 grandchildren. And I now have 3 great-grandchildren. And they are a delight. When I see how bright some of them are and how bright some of them aren't, you get to know them all, and you say, how can I help? What can I do to bring them along? I have one with autism, for example, and that tears me apart to see that poor kid and know what she is going through and what she faces for the rest of her life. But for the most part, we've been very, very lucky. And I look forward to being, like Friday of this week, we have a big family gathering, which we do quite often. And there are 1 or 2 that we won't have with us because she's in Florida, for example, living down there. But the occasion for Friday night is that the gal from Indiana, who happens to be a physician, and her husband is a physician, with a very desirable practice, because she's going to be here in New Jersey for 72 hours or so. So we'll get together and we'll tell stories and we'll show pictures and do all those things. And boy, that's so satisfying. I will be 88 shortly, and I've been lucky enough to enjoy good health. My eyesight isn't worth a damn, except I can see all these things. I can see all you, but I can't tell who you are, because macular degeneration destroys your central vision.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what has been lost for me. But we're presently, with the help of one daughter in particular who's an RN and has taken a keen interest in my problems, my vision problem, we were, as recently as yesterday, informed about a new experimental implant for macular degeneration that is presently in the hands of the, can't think of the name of it now.
Food and Drug Administration.
Food and Drug Administration. And so it may be that if I live long enough, something will come along that will make it possible for me to get familiar with your features.
Again.
And you, too, Ben. And meanwhile, I appreciate all your time and attention today. I know that you spent a lot of time here, and I'm sorry that we couldn't have done it a little more expeditiously.
Well, the weather intervened a little bit, but thank you, unless there's anything else you'd wanted to add.
No.
Thank you, General.